Okay. Morning, everybody. I'd really like to introduce a very good friend of mine, William Kendall. Going to talk about supermarkets, a subject he knows a lot about. So here we go.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And it's really very exciting to be here. I grew up not very far from here, but in a different county on the Greensand Ridge, looking at the enlightened people of North Hertfordshire, and I've finally been invited across the border to address them and the rest of you now. So very, very exciting. I'm not really going to talk about supermarkets, so if those of you who want to hear me talking about them, you can leave now. But I'm really going to talk about branding. And I mean, I having been to some extraordinary talks already today here, one is left sort of in awe of what people are doing around the world and what can be done. And I suppose it's also left me with this conclusion, which I've had ever since I've been in farming, which is all my life, which is what's the point of doing it if you don't actually hang on to the value? You know, farming for all of my life and for probably, my parents before it have just been producers, hard-working, brilliant, innovative producers, but they have not actually hung on to much or any of the value. And I suppose that's really, the supermarkets are blamed for that, but they're just part of the story. So, I mean, the supermarkets are actually in their own state of decline at the moment. The big four actually have they have a 10% lower share of market than they did 10 years ago. I mean, that doesn't necessarily something to celebrate if you're anti-supermarket, because they're probably fighting for their own lives at the moment, which makes it even harder for those of us who are primary producers to deliver. So what I want people to leave from my talk or take away from my talk is really how can we add value? How can we hang on to value? And this idea that getting up in the morning and doing all this hard work really isn't worth it unless you have worked out a strategy. It is the only industry, agriculture, it's the most important industry in the world, it's the biggest industry in the world, and it's the only one I can think of, maybe there are greater minds here who can come up with some exceptions, but the only one I can think of that doesn't do sales and marketing, that it doesn't think of where it's going to sell a product before it produces it, just produces, and expects other people to do the sales and marketing for them, which they will do, and they do brilliantly, but guess what? They hang on to all the value. That's not the picture. There was an earlier picture. Where's it gone? There was a picture of my great-grandmother. There she is, great-grandmother Kendall. She also lived on the Greensand Ridge, looking down on the enlightened people of North Hertfordshire 100 years ago. In 1903, she gave birth to her youngest daughter, my great-aunt Barbara, who's pictured there. She also lost my great-grandfather, aged 38. She lost her eldest daughter all within 2 months. So gave birth, became a widow, and lost her eldest daughter, who probably would have helped her through life. I have an advert, which I've lost, which is a shame, because it would have made probably a better slide than my great-aunt, in the local paper, the Biggleswade Chronicle, where she put an advert saying, and she hadn't even buried her husband at that point, saying, "I'm still open for business." She had a series, she was a large farmer, and she had a series of wagons and carts which went around the surrounding villages and towns, delivering fruit, vegetable, butter, dairy products, meat, to everybody. And she obviously felt it was very important as a young widow in 1903 to tell everybody who was writing her off and writing her business off because she was a woman that they shouldn't do so. She did that even ahead of all the other things that were going on in her family life. I like to think, I never met her, but I like to think that maybe I inherited some strange subversive gene from my great-grandmother about marketing, because I was the black sheep of the family. I was the person who at the market stall at the end of the drive, and my very dear father, who spent his entire life trying to get farmers to cooperate. He was part of the cooperative movement, which seemed to be the solution to post-war, post-rationing marketing, which is we do need to recognize it needs to be done, but let's get a clever person, let's pay for them to come in and do it all for us. And it was a smart enough idea, and it worked fairly well. The only problem was that the supermarket's rise was even more powerful and relentless, and so the cooperatives became a one-stop mugging shop for the farmers who were previously had sold individually and branded. So I had a stall at the end of the drive, and probably the most painful moment in my relationship with my father, which was otherwise very good, was when he drew up his Land Rover one day and said, I think those days are over, we don't need to do that anymore. And somebody who loved selling things, I was completely crushed by it. took me a long time to realize that this lay at the heart of the problem of farming. So I didn't hang around in farming, and I had some brief and unsuccessful careers in the city and as a barrister. But my first business was New Covent Garden Soup Company. So I'm going to give you a sort of brief canter through my sort of branded life and try and sort of, I hope it can illustrate to you, it can provide you with examples of how farming and food and branding do link up. And this was my dream job, Covent Garden Soup. I loved cooking, I loved good food, I loved farming. I had just done an INSEAD MBA, so I was quite pleased with myself. I had a CV which I thought looked really quite cool. And I went to the founder of Covent Garden Soup Company and showed him that, and he looked through it and he said, "You're a farmer's son, do you know where to buy cheap carrots?" And I did, because I grew up in East Anglia and I knew the carrot farmers, and I knew that there were carrots that were offcuts of the Marks and Spencer's baton carrots that go into their sort of crudité boxes. And so I was able to buy those effectively and actually transform the margins of this ailing business, and very quickly got promoted to run the business. So all to do with simple farming understanding. This brand was all around convenience. Britain was sort of going through a wave. This was the late 80s. It was going through a wave of further convenience. Couples were both working. It was the norm. But everybody also wanted authenticity. Everybody wanted food that tasted as good as homemade. And we were probably the first ready meal. We set ourselves a rule that we would never have ingredients that you wouldn't find in your own kitchen. And we talked endlessly about provenance and about where our food came from. And this is a picture of me, in case you hadn't worked it out. The only reason for showing you this, other than it's quite silly, but we grew Brussels sprouts. The Kendalls grew Brussels sprouts because they grew very well over the border in Bedfordshire. And the advertising agency, Bogle, Bartle, Hegarty, just thought it was so funny that there was a managing director of a food business who grew vegetables. It was just so weird that they had to tell the story. They had to write an advert, and actually it's rather pertinent now because it's all about Brussels and being, my position on the EU. But that's another story. But that's what lay behind it. We had got quite a lot. We'd done a Brussels sprout soup from Brussels, grown on the farm. We had got lots of coverage, and they read it and they said, "This is just perfect. The public are going to absolutely love it." And so, I hope you're, picking up this sort of developing theme now. It is such a good story when the producer can actually talk about their own product, and whether you can afford to, we couldn't afford to advertise, but anyway, we did. If you can afford to advertise it, then so much the better. But if you can just talk about it to people at trade shows or wherever you are, farmers markets, it resounds. So my next stage in my branded journey was I went on we bought a small organic business called Whole Earth Foods, which had attached to it an even smaller organic chocolate business. And the chocolate business was based all around being fair trade, being organic. We had a wonderful relationship with our suppliers in Belize. We had a little bit of money, and we did some consumer research, and we couldn't work out why people weren't buying more of our chocolate, because it was completely delicious. And we did some consumer research, and we discovered that customers didn't trust the fact that we were talking about fair trade and organic. People buy chocolate because it's a sin, it's an indulgence. And people who talk about provenance too readily are probably trying to cover up for the fact that it doesn't taste as good. So we did those wonderful consumer focus groups, and this keeps racing forward, but anyway, it doesn't matter. We did these consumer focus groups, and in the groups, we had groups of young women, so I think women between the age of 20 and 30, because they eat all the chocolate. And we had, so two of the groups were people who were eating chocolate already, and two were people who ought to be eating our chocolate. They were organic consumers, they did everything. And I remember vividly the sort of eureka light bulb moment when we worked out how we were marketing incorrectly, because people talked about organic very enthusiastically, and then the facilitator asked how they consumed their chocolate. And they said, oh, at the end of the day, I've kind of had enough doing organic. I've had enough. I've been to the gym. I've done all this stuff. I just want the chocolate. And very casually, she handed out some green and blacks, obviously not identified, and people started eating it. So this is really good. This is really good. How do you feel about it being organic? Well, that's even better news. So we realized that you have to start with a wrapper which, resonates with chocolate consumption. And then if you open up the wrapper, you can read the story of the fair trade. And the story was brilliant, by the way. I mean, we were working with a small group of farmers in the poorest part of Belize. By having a 5-year contract with them to pay a reasonable price, they were able to make commitments. They were able to repair the roofs on their houses. They led simple lives. The Mayan Indians, all they care about is having a decent house and their children's education. And they were able to cover both by that 5-year commitment. I mean, we annoyed the Fair Trade Foundation because we had this project on our own, which we came up with on our own, and there were lots of bits about the Fair Trade Foundation which were brilliant, but other bits not. But this was at the heart of what we did. But you still have to bring your customer with you, and if you want to tell them the story, work out what they want to hear first. And chocolate, you want to hear how delicious it is, and that's how it worked. So, branding is important, and I'm going to go on and talk about my farm branding after this. So, hold that thought for when you look at our egg box. So, I've told you the story of the Mayan Indians, and here's one of our friends, and the parents would come over, we'd bring them over, we'd get them to talk to the British press, and we always said to them, if ever we stitch you up, you've got the telephone numbers of the press. So, this is true fair trade, and it worked incredibly well. It worked every front. Back to advertising agencies. So this was the advert that the agency loved and won all the awards and had precisely zero impact on our customers. So this is the typical chocolate customer. This is the person who leads a good life, who cares about her family, but when she's got the end of a busy day, she wants the chocolate for herself, and she leads she takes a very selfish act. She throws her shopping on the ground, and she's got a bar of chocolate in her hand, and she's eating it, and she's feeling guilty. The public hated that. It won so many awards, but actually the adverts that worked were that we had a little bit of money left over to put on the tube cards, and we just talked about our ingredients and where they came from. That went down incredibly well. But this, we had, these were across track, I can't remember what they call, eight sheets or whatever, across tracks on certain busy tube stations, and people just looked at it bemused and thought, what a horrible woman. So my next brand journey is Corson Press. And by the way, I've brought some Corson Press along. There's some here and there's some on the table at the back, so do help yourself. I have been wondering why soft drinks all tasted rather horrible for quite a long time. I'm sure I'm not alone in this room for somebody who probably enjoys alcohol but doesn't always want to drink it. And I'm bewildered why when you go to a jolly party and there's delicious champagne or chilled white wine and you say, is there anything non-alcoholic, everyone looks slightly embarrassed, and then they find you some warm elderflower cordial and give you a badge saying loser at the same time. So we found a wonderful business which was making delicious juice and putting it in truly awful packaging. But the contents of it were completely fantastic. And so we took a great story. We took recipes that, again, the same old theme. These are recipes that people could relate to. We took rhubarb. Rhubarb, by the way, has become our signature drink, a flavor that nobody has ever used in soft drinks before. But the consuming public absolutely loves it. It's had a renaissance, not just in the UK, but all over the Western world. And so we have made sparkling drinks out of something as simple as pressed juice from the garden, from the fields. It doesn't contain anything other. It's just boring old pressed juice, but it's fantastic, and we just add some water to it. We had a little bit of sugar in there, but there's been a sugar tax, as some of you know, so we've taken that out, and we've just added a bit more juice. This is quite radical, by the way, in the world of soft drinks. I mean, it may sound very sort of straightforward to those of you and me in the farming community, but it's really radical to put something like juice in a can. It's quite difficult as well. So much easier just to put sugary flavored syrup, which is what most soft drinks, including our major competitors, do. So, there's a range of our drinks, which please do try them. And the latest one, which isn't on there, is actually so I got to peddle my wares for coming all this way across the border. But this is called Corson Dry, and this is literally water with a little bit of juice, tiny bit of juice. So it's all the criticisms about even juice being not that terribly good for you, we overcome it with this. I mean, it's going to be a hard sell, but in America, this product is going incredibly well. Not necessarily our brand, but the whole idea of true juice with water. This is my latest venture. This is a fermentation drink. It's kombucha. I'm sure many of you know what kombucha is already. This, again, it's based around, I mean, this is the first business I've ever started from scratch. We worked with someone called Louise Avery, whose name is on the bottom, and LA could be her initials. We developed branding around a product which is actually highly technical. Fermentation is a form, it's a form of brewing, and so we wanted to get across to people this wasn't just another soft drink. This is something that was both good for you, but also probably a solution to those of us who really don't want to drink alcoholic drinks all the time, but want something that is as complex and as dry and has all the depth of flavor. And so a lot of work went into the designing the branding for it and the flavors. Louise herself has a fantastic backstory. She's somebody who I think probably led a rather, I don't know, I want to say a wild life. That's probably very, but anyway, she led a young person's life in her 20s and discovered that she went to Mull to recover and regenerate and discovered all of the wonderful plants there and became a forager. And so all of that is sort of built into the brand which we talk about. And here is some of the marketing that we do around it, and we've raised £2.5 million so far just to sort of develop it. It's a nearly a $2 billion sector in the USA for kombucha. So in the UK, it's barely heard of. This is our farm on the coast in Suffolk. I still do come from the Green Sands of Bedfordshire, by the way, but my wife inherited a farm on the coast in Suffolk, and so that's where I mostly live. We decided to go organic about 20 years ago, largely because we had heard and read that it was better for the environment, it was better for nature, better for biodiversity. There wasn't, I mean, obviously there was a lot of talk about soil, but nobody really knew what it meant. And, I was interested in the marketing benefits of organic and in the biodiversity. The soil stuff, which we've all been talking about today, really wasn't high on most people's agenda. What was high on our agenda is that we wanted to grow good food in the countryside, good food that local people could buy. I mean, most farms around here are growing food that has no real relevance to their neighbours. Most of them are growing cereals which are fed to animals, probably not designed to even eat those cereals. And so we wanted to grow food that did work for our neighbours. We also wanted to create jobs. I mean, I grew up in a village, as I say, 10 minutes from here, and I'm not going to say everybody in the village worked, but everybody in the village had some connection with our farm, and probably at some point had worked on the farm. And my father's view was that he was very lucky to own the land, and his job was to create jobs. Looking back on it at the time, I thought all the jobs were, I don't know, they were just jobs, but if anybody came along with and said their son or daughter was leaving school next week and could they have a job on the farm, they got a job. It wasn't necessarily the best job they could aspire to, but it was a job. And so I feel very strongly that farms have forgotten what they're for. The cultural bit of agriculture has been forgotten. Most farms hardly employ anybody. So back in Suffolk, we employed half of one person when we went organic. We now employ about 9 people, 5 full-time equivalents. It's only a few hundred acres. So creating jobs is very important for me. Farming in conjunction with nature is also important, so we're organic. But we also, even on a few hundred acres of quite intensive agriculture, we have plenty of space for nature. We also believe in research. Research isn't paid for by the outer world very much, by business in the world of organic, so we have to do it ourselves. We've got Stephen Briggs here today, and who helped us a lot in the early days, but we have the second largest, he says, agroforestry experiment in the country going on, which is very compatible with the hens you can see there. And we also believe in access. We have hundreds and thousands of people visiting the farm every year. either interested in how we produce the food or in some of the research we're doing. As I said, we went organic, and effectively we were just another commodity producer. And it sort of struck me 3 or 4 years in. We grew our first cereal crop, we sold it. The grain merchant rang us up, having agreed a price, and said, I'm going to knock £5 off a tonne because it wasn't what I thought it was, even though he'd taken endless samples. And I vowed never to sell food wholesale again. So I bought a flour mill, and the flour mill produced lots of byproduct. What do you do with the byproduct? Well, get some hens, get some pigs. And so we got some hens. We then discovered that that when you have outdoor hens, you have quite a lot of muddy eggs, and you're not allowed to sell washed eggs anymore under whether it's the EU's regulations or Britain's. I think it's probably British regulations, but there we go. You're not allowed to sell them other than at the farm gate. So we got a rabbit hutch, and we started selling washed eggs at the farm gate. And we had people coming up the drive saying, can we buy anything else? And so the rabbit hutch turned into a cow shed. It's a help yourself, honesty, trust shop, as they call them in America. And it's doing better and better. I mean, our only problem is we cannot produce enough to keep the shop satisfied. We've just got a grant to build a bigger shop, but we're not going to change the central ethos of it being trust and people helping themselves, because they absolutely love it. They love the fact that everything is from the farm, although we do sell produce from elsewhere. We even sell some overseas produce now. We have a relationship with a citrus farmer in Valencia who is growing wonderful organic citrus on the national park. And in the middle of the winter, it's actually rather nice to be able to bring a range of warmer weather fruit and vegetables in from him. So these are our eggs, and I have been talking about good design and good branding, and when I talk to farmers, generally they say, "Yeah, but we're producers. You're very clever, or you know about branding." And I think, well, what do you need to know about branding to actually brand? I mean, that's the name of our farm. So you've got the name of the farm. That's the brand name, and we've got a lovely friend called Matthew Rice, who's many of you will know, who designed that for I don't think I even paid him, but anyway, he loves drawing chickens, so it wasn't very difficult to persuade him to do that. So there is our branding. I mean, you have to get the right labels on, and they change from time to time, but it's not very difficult to design a brand. Farmers invented brands. Let's remember that. It's a great name, but they invented brands for entirely functional reasons, to separate, to designate what they were doing and distinguish it from their neighbours' produce. So anyone who tells you it's hard work, they're wrong. We sell our eggs. We sell them through the farm shop, as I've just described, but we actually sell our eggs further afield. Some of you may have heard Ben Pugh, my friend yesterday, who has started up a fantastic business called Farm Drop, and we have invested in another business I'm involved in and I'm on the board of. So Farm Drop are our latest customer and actually our biggest customer. But a few years ago, Waitrose opened in our nearest town of Saxmundham, 1.5 miles away, and they sent flyers out to all of their target customers saying that they supported local farmers and they wanted to sell local food. And of course, actually, all they were talking about were products that they already had in their range, which happened to be local. They had a local coffee, and they had a local jam. So I rang up Waitrose and threatened to burn the store down. And I wouldn't recommend it, but fortunately, I got through to somebody who knew who I was, and they knew that I wasn't an arsonist. And they said, your timing is absolutely perfect, because we talk about local sourcing, and we are rubbish at it, and now is an opportunity to get good again. So we set up a local food initiative around the new store in Saxmundham. I found 20 suppliers who were interested in supplying supermarkets but had never supplied one before. And Waitrose were brilliant. They came down. We had a seminar with some of their senior people. People were very wary. I was surprised how wary people were about supplying a supermarket. Even just one. They somehow felt that just by putting their product in the supermarket, it was going to be the end of them. And, there were extraordinary things like we had a wonderful flower grower next to us, and they wanted his flowers, but he was really worried about putting barcodes on his flowers, which is something that you can print off a household printer. So, we overcame all those things, and we launched this initiative in Waitrose Saxmundham, and Waitrose Saxmundham became their most successful store as returns on square footage. So it's a small store, but it became the most, and it brought in all of the great and the good. The Waitrose sort of senior figures came down all the time to see what was going on. So the store staff felt very important. And anyway, on and it goes. I mean, Waitrose, Saxmundham is still the beacon. I have to say, the supermarkets, as I started, are struggling. Waitrose are probably struggling in their own sort of way, trying to decide whether they're a specialist store or whether they're a large multiple. So this is one of many initiatives, and it sometimes loses focus. But all I can say is that it works incredibly well for those of us who got through the door. We're now in 4 Waitroses locally. We sell very well. We're the most expensive eggs in our local Waitrose, and we're the best-selling egg. So, which they predicted, I didn't think was going to be possible given our price point. We get about 3 times more per egg than we would get by supplying organic eggs to the wholesaler who would normally supply Waitrose. No one's losing out. I mean, the wholesaler, I guess, is losing out, but they don't make much of a margin anyway. So we've just squashed the supply chain, and we are going into our local store, which happens to be a supermarket. I'm cantering even further now, but this is about trying to sell flowers with a provenance. We bought Moises Stevens a few years ago, which was the royal florist. The press, everybody loved the idea of flowers with provenance, flowers in season. There was so much stuff on flowers being flown in from all over the world, carbon footprints or whatever. It loved it, but the public just didn't buy it. And so it's a business that didn't work for us. And if we had another hour or so, I could go through all the other businesses that haven't worked for me as well. But that's a nice picture, so I thought I'd give you that as an illustration. We talked about Farm Drop. I mean, I'm sure some of you did hear. They've got a stand, I noticed, so I'm not going to talk. But Farm Drop, are an online farmers market. They do, based on 3 months of supplying, they do practice what they preach. They give you twice the return that you would typically get from supplying a supermarket, which is fantastic. And no quibbling about the price. They ask you how much you need to make, and then based on that, and they're growing very fast. I mean, it's tiny in the world of UK retailing, but they've got a similar business on the west coast of America that's grown much bigger, and they are using technology, they are using data in a very, very sophisticated way to deliver to people's doors the products that they really want on a very, very short supply chain, and that's now possible. So I'm very excited by these new initiatives. And my final slide, I just wanted to show you, because this is sort of new for me, but I was one of the judges on the BBC Food and Farming Awards recently, and Moskill Farm won the Future of Food Award. The BBC were furious with me and my other judge because they wanted robots, and we came in with three shortlisted finalists, and they were all in traditional farming. And they said, but last year a robot won it, and everybody loved it. And I said, well, I spend my life looking at robot farming, and I tell you, there were some great entries, but these were the best entries. Anyway, this farm, I think this guy's, and Paul, I think you should get him to come and speak in another year, but this chap, Bryce Cunningham, he grew up on a dairy farm, hated it, as most people who grew up on dairy farms did. His father and his grandfather ran it. He worked flat out. Age 16 or 17, he left, went to Glasgow and got a job with Mercedes. Because he was a dairy farmer's child, he got quick promotion because he knew how to work very hard and he didn't know what bank holidays were and things like that. And so 10 years later, his mother rang and said, your father has just been diagnosed with something really horrible and your grandfather's dying. He came back to sort of sort things out. Both died within a month of each other. The day after the father's funeral, the bank rang up and said, we need all the money back. They only owned 4 acres. The rest was tenanted. And his father had borrowed a lot of money to intensify his dairy herd. And so he paid back the money. He sold off 2/3 of the dairy herd. He kept the purebred Ayrshire cows. The reason why Robbie Burns is on there, by the way, is it's the same farm as Robbie Burns farmed on. I mean, how cool is that? And so this guy, he was left with absolutely nothing. And he said, well, as I've got nothing, I'm going to go organic, and I'm going to get into this soil regeneration lark, because everyone's talking about it. I'm not going to take my calves away from my cows. I'm not going to poll my Ayrshire cows, because they look great on it. And he started selling the milk, and worked out how much he needed to sell it for, which is about 5 or 6 times what an industrial dairy farmer would get. People started paying for it. He bought a £9,000 dairy from, I think it was 1950s dairy. He bought it on eBay. And he put it all together because he was a trained engineer from Mercedes. And he quickly found that people valued the milk, partly because of the story, partly because it tasted absolutely delicious. I haven't drunk a pint of milk in 30 years. I drank a pint of it, and it just tasted like nothing else. The way he pasteurizes it, and you have to pasteurize, there's no raw milk in Scotland. The way he pasteurized it meant that the baristas in the coffee shops further and wild actually found it much, much more valuable, so they started asking for it. Anyway, 3 years on, this guy cannot produce enough milk on his farm. He is marketing all of the dairy milk, all of the output of the 2 other organic farms in Ayrshire. You can tell they have different cap covers depending on whether it's his or whether it's that. He's got 2 vans on the road 24/7. And then just the sort of final thing is he got fed up with the whole plastic thing, so he decided to go plastic-free at the beginning of this year, and he did a crowdfunding exercise. This is how I got it past the BBC. I said, this is the future of farming. This guy is using innovative finance. He did a crowdfunding exercise to buy 30,000 bottles so that he could get rid of all the plastic. Anyway, I'm sorry he's not here, but I hope I've done a good job in explaining to you, with absolutely nothing, you can do everything if you really believe in what you're doing. And that's the message I want to leave you with.